I wanted to begin with a story. And for those who've read my description, this story charts more than 400 years of history. And it's a kind of wild ride, and one that will end in June of 2020 of this year. I must warn you that it's rather violent, and I won't hold back in describing some of that violence. So I just want to tell some of the audience that now. Of course, you're free to turn off the sound if you need to. So without further ado, I wanted to share my screen with you. I have a lot of images to share and a text to share as well. So this is where it begins, with a severed foot that's been sliced off a bronze monument. What was exercised with this cut? What spirits were released, and what stories? The event was described as follows. On a moonless night early in January of 1998, just as Hispanic New Mexicans were starting to celebrate the 400th year anniversary of the first Spanish settlement in the American West, an American Indian commando group stealthily approached a bronze statue here of the first conquistador, Juan de Oñate. With an electric saw, the group slowly severed his right foot, boot, stirrup, star-shaped spur, and all. And they timed their intervention well. The lone police officer in the town of Alcalde was away on his annual vacation that weekend. To this day, no witnesses have come forward, and the location of the foot is still not known. Now, that's not entirely true, and you'll see why soon. The day after cutting off the foot, the anonymous Friends of Acoma Pueblo, as they call themselves, sent letters to various media outlets across New Mexico. To the Albuquerque Journal, they wrote, "We invite you to visit the Oñate Distortion Museum and Visitor Center, located 8 miles north of Española. We took the liberty of removing Conquistador Juan de Oñate's right foot on behalf of our brothers and sisters of Acoma Pueblo. This was done in commemoration of his 400-year anniversary, acknowledging for his unasked for exploration of our land. We will be melting his foot down and casting small medallions to be sold to those who are historically ignorant," end quote. They added that we see no glory in celebrating Oñate's 4th centennial, and we do not want our faces rubbed in it. If you must speak of his expedition, speak the truth in all its entirety. They also sent a letter to the Santa Fe Reporter, and in that letter they wrote, "New Mexico is poised for a grand celebration of the Quattrocentenario, and we could not let that happen without voicing our existence. Outside of Indian art and gaming, in quotes, we have become an invisible people, even to ourselves. Many of our people have forgotten how to live. Our actions redirect the thinking of those who've forgotten us." So along with the suggestion to melt down the foot and to make medallions to sell to the historically ignorant, and that was an idea I particularly liked, other ideas that they had for this foot were cutting it off 23 more times, or perhaps to use the image for a new stamp in recognition of the Quattrocentenario, and to create a new statue of the religious leader from Okeowinge, which was formerly known as San Juan Pueblo, and his name was Pope. So they proposed to make that from the melted metal of this foot. But the story begins far before this moment. So for this, we must go back in time to a more ancient story, a myth that has repeated itself over centuries. And that myth is called Cibola, or the 7 cities of gold. So Spanish interest in the Southwest was initially sparked by the stories of 4 men shipwrecked off the coast of what is now modern-day Texas. The men were part of the ill-fated Navarras exhibition. So in the summer of 1536, after an 8-year-long trek across the North American continent by foot, they arrived in what is now present-day Mexico City. Upon their arrival, they recounted stories of fertile and populous lands to the north, and these places that were rife with turquoise, bison hides, gold, and other metals. And these weren't tall tales, because many of these things that they had witnessed firsthand. And for the Spanish, the news was electrifying. It added further evidence to the belief that there were fantastically wealthy cities in the north. And for them, this propped up the centuries-old myth of the 7 golden cities. They thought that they had found them. So in 1539, Antonio de Mendoza, the viceroy of New Spain, sent out 4 men on a reconnaissance mission. And this included Marcos de Niza, who was a Franciscan friar who was experienced in navigation and cosmography. Another friar, Ornato, as well as a native guide who remains unnamed in historical texts, as well as Esteban, a North African slave of one of the original shipwreck men. He was originally from Morocco. So in historical texts, they say that Esteban had misgivings about the journey and he didn't want to go. He was refusing to go. But Marcos and his party, Marcos Ornato, fell ill. A month into the journey, he was forced to return, traveled over 1,000 miles from the settlement of San Miguel de Culacan to what were 7 Zuni communities in present-day New Mexico. And they forced Esteban to come with them. Marcos's texts of what he saw recount a kingdom called Cibola, a place that he said was larger than Mexico City. And here's an image, an artist's rendition of what it may have looked like. And from which local and native informants described as wealthy beyond belief. But consider that there were different conceptions of wealth for the Spanish and also for local native populations. But Marcos never really exactly reported cities of gold, but this didn't stop the Spanish from trying to seek them out. He also never entered the walls of what they thought was Cibola. His description was purely based on testimonies from informants and the view from afar. Because upon reaching the Zuni settlements, Esteban was reportedly killed after he failed to heed their orders to turn back. And Marcos would have met a similar fate had he soldiered on. So here's an image to give you a sense of a pueblo. So fueled by Spanish imaginings of Cibola, the real existence of this fabled city, a much larger expedition led by then governor of Nueva Galicia, conquistador Francesco Vasquez de Coronado, followed on the heels of Marcos's journey. This was a ruinous 4,000-mile trek that spanned from Western Mexico to what is modern-day Kansas. But it wasn't all for loss, because during his journey, Coronado, also a conquistador, succeeded in claiming the lands that they traveled through in the name of Spain, including all of present-day New Mexico. The expedition bankrupted most of those involved, and only 100 of the original 1,000 men sent out returned. And the fabled 7 cities of gold were never found. The Spanish, having conquered many of the great cities in the lower half of the New World, needed to believe in Cibola's existence. They needed it. The fabled city, for them, offered the means to continue to fuel their imperial mission. So the very idea that there might be cities of gold is perhaps not so absurd, considering the exceptional material wealth that they had already amassed from pillaging the great cities and cultures of Mesoamerica, much of which they took was also gold. One of the characteristics of imperialism is the idea of extraterritoriality. This need for territorial expansion is driven by what becomes a near irrational desire for material possessions, things like spices, sugar, slaves, rubber, cotton, opium, gold, silver. In other words, profit and hope of future profit was vital to the expansion of Western empires, including this one. But as Edward Said observes, and some of those are his words, something else is at play as well. Profit, while a driving force of imperialism, is superseded by inertia. And that is, he describes, a commitment in the constant circulation and recirculation of these material possessions. So you can kind of see how this underpins colonialism as well. And underpinning all of this are complex ideologies of domination. So Said says, and I really like to be reminded of this quote, that neither imperialism nor colonialism is a simple act of accumulation and acquisition. Both are supported and perhaps even impelled by impressive ideological formations that include notions that certain territories and people require and beseech domination, as well as forms of knowledge affiliated with domination. The vocabulary of classic 19th century imperial culture is plentiful with words and concepts like inferior or subject races, subordinate peoples, dependency, expansion, and authority. Out of the imperial experiences, notions about culture were clarified, reinforced, criticized, or rejected. And we can see how many of those words continue to circulate today. So it was the desire for riches that brought the Spanish north to claim Nueva España or New Mexico, but it was the underlying ideologies that accompany imperialism that kept them there. So the information, and this is an artist's rendering of Coronado's journey. The information regarding Cibola that was brought back by Fray Marcos followed closely on the heels of the discovery of gold in Peru, and it led many in Mexico to further believe in the cities of gold. So in 1598, on the orders of King Philip II, Oñate y Salazar began the process of colonizing the northern portion of modern-day New Mexico. He founded San Gabriel near Oquehuingue, or what was then San Juan Pueblo, and he declared this the first capital. Among other settlements, he also became the region's first governor. He also claimed that he was a Criollo, and that is someone of pure Spanish blood born in the New World. And after doing some digging, and this is kind of fascinating to find out, a poet whose name, and you might laugh at this, his name was also Viagra, uncovered something else. And that is that the Spanish woman recorded as his mother could not have given birth to him as she was in Spain at the time. So Viagra puts forth, and now others agree, that on his mother's side, Oñate was in fact a descendant of the great Emperor Montezuma II. So perhaps unaware of his own heritage or claiming ignorance, Oñate married his relative, Doña Isabel Cortés Montezuma, the granddaughter of both Hernan Cortés and the Emperor Montezuma II. So Oñate, born of the conquest of the New World and the violence that flowed from the first moment that European ships docked on the shores of the Americas, was in fact not of pure Spanish blood, but a mix. He was also indigenous. And the violence began almost immediately upon his arrival in New Mexico. In October of 1598, 11 soldiers in the Spanish military and 2 of their servants were killed at Acoma Pueblo after a skirmish erupted. The Spanish military, under orders of then conquistador governor, and that was Oñate, demanded that the Queras people at Acoma Pueblo turn over all of their food supplies. And remember that these would have been supplies to ensure their survival over the winter, but also many, many years of drought, of possible drought, because Acoma, like all of the Pueblo and other peoples that were living in this area at the time that Oñate turned up, knew how to deal with the seasons. They knew how to grow crops in the desert. They knew how to store seeds. They knew the timing, the precise timing of the crops in the desert. And in fact, it's argued that they also had more accurate timekeeping devices than those available in Europe at the time, because it was very important to time everything that you did based on not only the seasons, but when it was appropriate to seed and when it was appropriate to harvest. But it wasn't only the demand for supplies that led to the killings. Instead of first negotiating with Acoma leaders, the Spanish snuck into the pueblo like cowards. And history says that they raped at least one Acoma woman before raiding all of the community's carefully prepared food stores. And these were food stores for years. The stores contained supplies like corn and other seeds. So this was a massive violation because it didn't just violate them in that moment, it violated their future survival. But it was the death by the Acoma people of one of the soldiers that hit close to home. Oñate's nephew was among those who were killed. Retaliation was swift and without remorse. In January of 1599, and under Oñate's orders, Spanish military ruthlessly killed what was a massacre. They massacred 800 villagers, and they didn't spare women or children. They enslaved the remaining 500 villagers who were brought to Okeunge to face trial. And in a true form of New World justice, it was Oñate who presided over the trial. So he acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The surviving villagers were handed stiff sentences for charges of rebellion and the murder of Juan de Zalvadar, 10 Spaniards, and 2 servants. Girls under 12 were placed in the charge of Fray Alonso Martinez, and boys in the charge of Vicente de Zalvadar. 60 other girls were sent to convents in Mexico. Women over 12 faced 20 years of forced servitude, which is another word for slavery, and men between the ages of 12 and 25 faced the same. Then, on Oñate's orders, the right foot of every man over the age of 25 was amputated. Between 24 to 80 men were mutilated as part of this decree. And it wasn't just men from Acoma who suffered. 2 Hopi who happened to be visiting Acoma at the time also had their feet cut off, and they were sent back to their communities as evidence of the punishment, the severe punishment for rebellion. And the innocence of other Pueblo communities was also not spared. The sentence, the cutting of the feet, continued over the coming days in all nearby Native villages. Many years later, after seeming unending violence and slavery, the slow religious conversion of Pueblo communities to Catholicism, and with many of the original settler families abandoning New Mexico because they were treated no better. In 1606, Oñate was fined and permanently banned from the region. He was forced to return to Mexico City, where he faced charges of both cruelty to natives and colonists. Later, his conviction was overturned by appeal, and he eventually made his way to Spain, where he was appointed head of the country's mining operations by the king. So the kind of colonial extraction that he began continued. So we know that defacing a human body or even a public statue can release a surplus of energy. Much of this energy happens to be negative. So anticipating the 400-year anniversary of Oñate's arrival in New Mexico, the Oñate Monument and Visitors Center opened near Okeunge. The equestrian monument made by Albuquerque artist Sonny Rivera was at the heart of this Visitors Center. And here's an image of it here. So the monument and the Visitors Center was introduced by a bill through the state Senate, and funding was later secured through grants and also tax bonds. But it wasn't until the 400-year anniversary that the monument met the same fate as so many Pueblo men before, when early in January, the same time as the original act, just many hundreds of years later, the statue's foot was removed and images of the brute and its letters circulated to local media. And it was this act, done quietly in the dead of night, that trumped many of the planned Quattrocentenario celebrations, and it made international news. The monument's defacement once again brought into public consciousness the dark and bloody history of Spanish arrival in New Mexico, which in many cases had been forgotten. So the monument could no longer serve as a hero to the ignorant. Here's an image of the person who was working at the visitor center at the time. And of course, he's showing where the foot was cut off. And in a kind of funny story, the foot thief, and that's a moniker of his own making, said that when they realized that no one noticed that the foot had been cut, they called the visitor center. And supposedly this man here, when he heard that the foot was cut off, he dropped the phone and he immediately ran out to look at the evidence. But what the memorial obscures, perhaps, is the most successful Indigenous resistance to take place in the Southwest. And here's an image of Pope, its leader. So people in what is now northern New Mexico had lived under imposed Spanish rule for some 80 years prior to the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. The nomadic, or the largely nomadic, Navajo and Apache managed to escape much of this tyranny. Yet this was not the first time that they, together with their strategic allies, drew up arms against their invaders and those seeking to civilize them in the name of religion. To cite the late John Berger, he says that each tyranny finds and improvises its own set of controls, which is why they are so often, at first, not recognized as the vicious controls that they are. So the various Pueblo peoples who took part in the revolt, among them the Caras, Tomperos, Tiwas, Toas, Piros, and Zuni, were by no means a homogeneous group at all. Many did not speak the same language. We know that the word Pueblo is of Spanish origins, and it later came to collectively identify these various communities. But there were many factors that contributed to the uprising. Among the most significant was the Acoma War, an event that was still likely burning in the memory of every Indigenous person in the region. So the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 took the priests and colonists largely by surprise. Key to the Pueblo's stealth was their use of a knotted rope calendar, and you can see that Pope is holding it here. And this was a form of counting ubiquitous in Mesoamerica prior to Spanish arrival, and it continued, of course, after. Knotted ropes were then distributed among all the communities, with the instructions indicating for their leaders to untie one knot for each day leading up to the revolt. When the final knot was undone, each of these Pueblo groups, some divided by hundreds of miles, knew it was time to attack. On August 10th, 1680, Catholic priests were killed, churches were destroyed, and haciendas were raided. Those who survived this first attack, those settlers who survived this first attack, sought refuge in the capital of Santa Fe. It is estimated that 2,500 Pueblo warriors invaded the capital later that August, capturing the city by first severing the water supply. The majority of Spaniards who survived the attack, along with their Tiwa allies, retreated southward to El Paso del Norte. And notice that their first act was to sever the water. And they did that because it was a learned method. It was something that Cortez had also practiced as well. So the 12-year period that followed the reclaiming of Santa Fe essentially fell out of history. Some now view this as yet another act of strategic resistance. Having observed the high value that the Spanish and the Franciscan priests placed on the written word, Native resistors took it upon themselves to destroy every single document that they could find. And during this time, the written word slipped back into oral testimony, essentially shutting out conventional historical inquiry. What is known is that relatively soon after the Pueblo Revolt, Pope's leadership began to wane. Introduced diseases continued to take the lives of Native people at a rapid rate. And the galvanizing force that initially brought them together, the galvanizing force of change, also dissipated. But all wasn't lost. Collaboration now with Pueblo peoples, as well as archaeological evidence, and the increased legitimacy of oral testimony within so-called official narratives. Additional information has surfaced about this period, a time when history went underground. Cultural revitalization, for example, was integral to this revolt of 1680. New understandings of the spatial organization of early Pueblo Revolt era villages reveal the extent to which leaders, and I quote, used architecture in village locations to establish a revitalization movement. So the attack on Santa Fe was meant to take place on August 13th, but priests got wind of the planned uprising after they captured and questioned 2 young Pueblo boys. So in response to the breach, Pope moved the revolt up by 2 days. And him, as well as other leaders, encouraged Pueblo people at the time to rid their lives of the influence of the Spanish colonists, to revive their traditional pre-Hispanic ceremonies and belief. The Pueblo Revolt remains an exceptional moment of indigenous resistance, one never again replicated in the northern Spanish frontier. However, even so-called decolonization and the growth of supranationalism are not the termination of these imperial and later colonial relationships. But to cite Edward Said again, they are merely the extending of a geopolitical web which has been spinning since the Renaissance. But public memory, as we know it, is short. And certain histories, particularly those that don't support official narratives, can quite quickly fall to the margins. The monument to Pope is not in New Mexico, but Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, conquistador monuments continue to spread through the Southwest like an infectious disease. So inspired by this first monument, after the 400-year anniversary, in 2006, an even larger equestrian monument was built in El Paso, Texas, to commemorate Oñate by the sculptor John Sherrill Hauser. This one measured 34 feet tall and cost an estimated $2 million to cast. At the time, it was the largest equestrian monument in the United States, and of course, the largest conquistador monument. And it took nearly 9 years to complete. Its unveiling was met with protests, and many Acoma people, among others, traveled to El Paso to voice their displeasure and again to make their story known. The founders of this monument, perhaps realizing their wrong-headed intentions, became increasingly evasive as to its intent and what it was meant to symbolize and commemorate. It is now not formally specified as a monument of Oñate, although it is, and even his name is inscribed on the bottom of one of the stirrups, but simply as an equestrian monument instead. However, in the sculptor's words, everybody always writes, and the horse is the equestrian, which represents Don Juan de Oñate. So what difference does it make? He said. There are other things about it too. Like I said, his name being inscribed on the stirrups, and of course he looks exactly the same as he does in all the other monuments. And anybody who bothers to look, they can find that in the design. And then the sculptor also goes on to say that there's lots of other markings on the horse that reflect clearly who it is. And around that same time, in 2004, after a decade of controversy, yet another ambitious monument was erected to Oñate and the first Spanish settlers. This one sits in front of the Albuquerque Museum, and it's about a 10-minute walk from my house. And this is how it looked a little over 3 years ago. And at the time, it was the most contentious, at the time it was erected, it was the most contentious piece of public art in Albuquerque's history. And the monument, first planned in 1997 as a collaboration between the artists Betty Sabo and Sonny Rivera, and you will remember him as that first monument to Oñate in Alcalde, so there's 3 of them now, And to quell some of the controversy, city officials decided that they needed to work with a native artist. And they contacted Santa Clara Pueblo artist Nora Naranjo Morse. Morse stated in a newspaper article in 2005 that when she received that call in 1997, it changed her life. After uncovering more about the Spanish arrival, she realized that she could not participate in the project as planned and created a different work instead. Kind of counter monument, as it were. But before I share with you the response that Nora made, I want to tell you a little bit more about the commissioning of this sculpture, something that was advocated for by the then mayor of Albuquerque. So when they dug a little deeper beneath the surface of the statue, it was starting to look more and more like an inside job, a pet project of the mayor and his supporters who were all Hispanic. So Millie Santillanes, who was then head of the Hispanic Culture Preservation League and was later appointed to the city's Cultural Services Directorship, lobbied for the monument to be placed in a nearby park, a park that had been created to commemorate Tiwa Pueblo people, the original inhabitants of Albuquerque. The park happened to be across from her home. So to embed things further, the monument was a reflection of those in power at the time. The models for the first Spanish settlers, of which you see an image here, were none other than Mayor Chavez, who commissioned the monument. And this is him with the sheep or the lamb around his shoulders. His ex-wife, Margaret Aragon de Chavez, Santillanes, and her grandchildren. So what is the purpose of history if you can't see yourself in it? And one newspaper article at the time said that, yet the city still appears to be nervous about residents' reaction to the artwork. Story has it that when the monument was completed, on a light pole by La Jornada, or the Journey, as this piece is called, a security camera aims down at the bronze figure of Oñate, and it's focused on his feet. And this is the work of Nora Naranjo Morse when it was first installed. So she remarked that perhaps there were generations of Pueblo people like me who were educated in public schools who hadn't been given the complete story of Pueblo colonization. Many of the Pueblo people I'd spoken to had been given basically the same glorified, romantic, and antiseptic version of what took place during that period in time. An Yakima woman in her 60s told me that not only did she not get information in school, but she also didn't get it at home, simply because the historical trauma was so great. Her family didn't speak of that dark period of time as if to utter Oñate's name would bring an illness. And that's the end of Nora's quote. The New Mexican Hispanic Culture Preservation League, the group who lobbied for the initial creation of the monument, had a different take. For them, and I quote from a brochure that they made at the time, the memorial was an opportunity to help correct a deficiency of Spanish history in New Mexico public education. So they were right about the fact that it was a deficiency, but just not a direction that they were necessarily interested in taking. So one day when I was walking to take photos of this Oñate statue a few years ago, I was walking with my husband, Raven Chacon, and we noticed something else beside the imposing bronze statues. And it was the beginnings of the path. And at its entrance, there was a metal plaque, and the sign read, Nora Naranjo Morse, Numbe Wege, our center place. And I was thinking, this is not a counter monument necessarily, but something else. So in an attempt to create a meaningful response to history, Nora Naranjo Morse used her sculpture to tell the basic truths of Pueblo worldview, including earth, water, and plant life, read the didactic. So here's what it looks like now. It's an environmental landscape, and it was commissioned by the Albuquerque Museum as a response to Oñate's arrival in New Mexico. And at the center, when you follow that path, is this rock. And quite poignantly, From my mind anyway, it's absent of any grandiose ideas of monumentality. Her work, I think, reestablishes Pueblo understandings of the land. It's a quiet piece. When you're in it, you can hear birds chirping. They use it as a kind of small ecosystem. It's also not a false idol. Importantly, you can't immediately see it in its entirety and simply digest it with your eyes. You have to walk it. You have to experience it with your body and begin something of your own journey. And in that, I think it shifts the perspective of what's worth honoring, not this murderous man that's situated to the right of this piece, but the land. And the way that I used to end my thinking around this project was with an image of these two horses. I used to talk about the ability to free them from the burden of history by removing the conquistadors from their backs. But times have changed, and Oñate's spirit is not so easily evaded. So after first hearing of the story of the monument, and this was around 2013, I never quite got it off my mind. I also never got that original act, the cutting of the foot, off my mind, both of the people, the Acoma people, but also of the monument itself. I wanted to know who did it, and I wanted to know more about why. So as I said before, monuments, often inert, tend to transform in times of unrest or in times of historical reckoning. And with that, an inordinate amount of energy is released in their defacement, and much of this can be negative. On September 30th of 2017, an article cropped up in the New York Times rather unexpectedly. The person who had cut off the foot had reappeared some 20 years later, and he wanted to tell his story. And the article written by Simon Romero says that, and I quote, "The foot thief smiled when discussing how his act of sabotage was stirring ghosts. He had melted down a portion of the foot to make medallions for Pueblo leaders, but otherwise it remains mostly as it was when he had sawed it off. I always wanted to walk the foot all the way to Acoma," he said. "Or maybe it'll get buried as a time capsule. Not the spur, though, which you see held in his hand here in this image." He explained how he wanted to keep that as a trophy from his act. "That will be mine forever." So the foot thief, and again, this is a name of his own taking, he came out by slipping documentary filmmaker Chris Eyre a note, at a bar, in fact, revealing that he was the one who sawed off the foot all of those years ago. And when the New York Times article cropped up, Jose Luis Blondet and Rebecca Trieb and I were in the midst of working on an exhibition, the 2018 Site Santa Fe biennial exhibition called Casa Tomada. And while we were driving by the monument, Jose and I were on our way to Taos, New Mexico, and he remarked, nearly in unison with me, that we needed to get the foot, because we knew now that it was out there. So in a time of increasing divisiveness about borders between who might be an insider and outsider, who belongs and who doesn't, as well as who decides, we thought that this object, the stolen foot, might just be the item we need to spark deeper conversations about the roots of these divides. So in collaboration with Eyre, who's someone I happen to know, who became our proxy in negotiations with the foot thief, we were able to make an exact replica of the foot out of micaceous earth. And the clay was significant. It was flecked with the glint of mica, and it sparkles in the sun. And this was the very material that led Fray Marcos all of those years ago to think that he had found Cibola, or the 7 cities of gold. Instead, what he found, or what he saw, were the sparkling walls of a Zuni village. So we were able to cast the foot. And together with the collaboration of the foot thief includes some important documents nearby. And as a kind of footnote to his original act, he wrote a new letter to accompany this display. So this was included along with a model of the pendant of the boot and the spur that had been made from melted bronze of the original severed foot. And the letter that he wrote read, 20 years ago, on the night of December 29th, 1997, we cut off the right foot of Don Juan de Oñate in Alcalde. Though it took almost a week before anybody noticed, this simple act forced the state of New Mexico to re-examine its 400th anniversary celebration, the Quattrocentenario. It caused dialogue to occur between the church, the state, and the pueblos. It was not a case of rewriting history, but rather shining a light on it. Make no mistake, the arrival of the Spanish church and state in the Southwest was an invasion, not an entrada. On this continent, the original inhabitants have suffered greatly at the hands of those who came later. We cannot change history. All that we can ask is that it be written truthfully. We were here first. We are here now. We wish to be a part of the fabric of the future. Imagine if you had to honor all the treaties ever agreed to and signed by the US government. We are not invisible. Include us in decisions about the land, the future, our land, we, the people. It was signed on behalf of our brothers at Acoma. Yet, Oñate's spirit has not finished haunting us. On June 15, 2020, the violence of colonial history erupted yet again, this time in Albuquerque's Old Town, again, just a short walk from our house. It began at what was initially a peaceful protest to call for the removal of the Oñate Monument. And this was a part of a wave of actions, as you know, across the United States that summer for the removal of colonial monuments, as well as those that uphold white supremacy. I was out of town that day and watching the Instagram live feed of my husband, Raven Chacon, pictured here in the green mask in the center of this image, when the feed abruptly cut off and I saw everyone running and they were shouting. Shortly afterwards, he texted 2 words to me, Scott, shot. I felt like I couldn't breathe. We'd been texting about the heavy presence of armed militia there at the gathering, and they called themselves the New Mexico Civil Guard, as well as the presence of someone who was clearly acting strangely, someone who other protesters felt might be an undercover cop. Before the Instagram feed cut off, Raven told me that they had repeatedly asked him to leave and that he was growing increasingly agitated. He started pushing people and he had violently thrown a woman to the ground with such force that her head bounced off the pavement. This person was Stephen Ray Baca, son of a former Bernalillo County Sheriff's deputy and who had made a failed run for city councilor. Baca later stated that he attended the event to defend the monument. But it was when he was being asked to leave and departing the scene that he turned and shot at Scott. Scott survived 4 gunshot wounds at point blank range. A few minutes earlier, Raven and I were texting about the minimal presence of police despite the presence of the militia with their guns and their open intimidation tactics towards the protesters. Earlier in the summer, a friend, Marissa DeMarco, as well as she's also Scott's friend, musician and performer, and she's to the right of Raven in this photograph holding a microphone, had helped break a story about the cozy relationship between Albuquerque police and civilian militia groups. The police had been taking meetings with the militia, many of which are open white supremacists. And they didn't intervene when they showed up en masse to other Black Lives Matter events and Red Nation protests over the summer. On the police scanner, they were often referred to as friendlies. Let me say that again. So on the scanner, the police referred to them as friendlies. And it was only after things turned ugly that day in June that the police and city officials denounced the militia, and stopped openly cooperating with them. So getting back to our question as to why there wasn't more of a police presence, despite the escalating tensions, it later turned out that the police were indeed there along, but they were hiding inside the museum. And it would take many minutes before they arrived on the scene of the shooting to both arrest the shooter, who immediately declared himself as the son of a sheriff, which isn't exactly true, to arrest the militia members, and to provide any sort of medical aid to Scott, who's here at the center of this image. So one of the first on the scene was in fact Scott's dad, a retired emergency medic who ran towards the sounds of gunfire before realizing that his son was indeed the victim. He had to aggressively assert his rights to provide aid to his son, even when he was being asked to leave by the police. Scott's mother, after realizing that her son was injured, also tried to come to his aid. And after explaining to police officers who she was, one told her, and I quote, "I don't care if you're the fucking Virgin Mary, you're not getting over there." So Scott's parents, not once to seek any form of public attention, spoke with journalists at the university radio station, KUNM, to describe their hostile treatment from police that evening and to provide more background on Scott's work as both an activist and an artist. Scott is making a slow recovery from his injuries. They were extensive, and he continues his fight for racial justice. Stephen Ray Baca was arrested and initially jailed, although he's out now on bond, on suspicion of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, and his trial continues. Shortly after the shooting, actually within a day, both Oñate statues were unceremoniously removed from their pedestals by civic workers. And here you see Oñate being laid down. This site also became something of an informal memorial for months after the incident. And here's the rather unceremonious departure of the Oñate monument in Alcalde. In both cases, officials in Alcalde and Albuquerque indicated that the monument removals were not necessarily permanent. What they said was that the monuments were being removed for their own safekeeping. So meanwhile, in Albuquerque, Mayor Tim Keller publicly denounced the violence that led to Scott's shooting, as well as the civil militia. The fate of this monument, he said, would be decided through community consultation. To date, this communication on this consultation has been flawed. It has been poorly advertised and organized, and missing key voices from Indigenous and other communities. Artists and community organizers, including Autumn and Nanaba Chacon, as well as Scott, among many, many others, continue to press for more transparency with regards to not only the fate of the statues, but structural racism within civic institutions, including the Albuquerque Museum, the grounds upon which the monument to Oñate and the first Spanish colonists remain partly installed. And by way of ending, I wanted to share a few words about Scott Williams, my friend. Williams is an artist, an activist, and an MA student in museum studies at the University of New Mexico. In 2016, Raven and I invited him to make a new work for a vacant lot that we own that runs alongside Lomas Boulevard. From time to time, the lot becomes a site for public sculpture and performance. For Off Lomas, Scott made a series of canvas flags that slowly unravel in the wind. And when a breeze catches them just right, together they spell out a part of a poem he wrote. And the words are, "This valley is filling with the blood of ghosts, and we are as close to drowning in blankets as we've ever been." And by way of contextualizing these words, Scott wrote that the current darkness of this relatively isolated valley experiences more property crime, violence, and murder on any given day than any other watershed, any other major watershed in any part of America. The anguish is not new and not shocking to those affected by it, because for centuries, this valley has lived under the shadows of colonialism. So I wanted to end with those words and this picture of the flags at rest.